Hello. I'm very happy to be here. I've been here in the village for 3 days now, and I want to thank everybody for making me feel so at home. I've been at a lot of sort of interfaith gatherings where they play Imagine, and I always think, did they hear him say, "Imagine no religion"? Or do they just sort of gloss over that part? I like to think it has a deeper meaning than what's obvious. You'll have to bear with me. You know those Hindu statues that have 4 arms? I wish I was one of them because I have to change the slides, hold this, and turn pages. I hope I don't need to drink. So the title of my talk this morning is What We Can Learn from the East. And I always think it should be titled What We Have Learned from the East, because we already have, as we'll see, and because everybody in this sanctuary has already been deeply affected by the teachings that have come to us over the centuries from the ancient seers and sages of India, and have been transmitted throughout the world in different forms, different expressions over the centuries. And if you think you're not among those who have been affected by the East, you will in a minute. I want to start, and I have to say, I spoke last night at the Lyceum, and we went on for almost 2 hours. So this is, I have to really watch myself and the clock. This is the Cliff Notes. I want to begin with a quote. It's a rather provocative quote. Those of you who were there last night heard me do this, so no cheating. The Christian religion has answered our needs up to the present age, but the evolution of the Spirit has created a demand for a religion of a broader scope, and we turn to the lore of India for lack of a better system near home. Do you know who said that? No cheating if you were there last night. Anybody? It was in 1889. Does that give you a clue? It was Charles Fillmore. And he said that in the 2nd issue of Modern Thought magazine, which later became Unity magazine. I find that pretty remarkable. He also said in that same issue that the East was the nursery of spiritual philosophies and the storehouse of a spiritual life that we cannot adequately comprehend in our present material thought environment. So, now you see why I can confidently say all of you are affected by the East, because the founders of Unity were affected by the teachings of the East. And they incorporated what they learned from the sacred texts of India that Charles and Myrtle were reading at that time into their own insights, into other sources, Christian sources, and that evolved eventually into Unity. And if you look at the core ideas, especially of the Vedanta philosophy that came from India, and match them side by side with the core principles of Unity, you'll find unity. you'll find a great harmony there. Not only were the founders of Unity inspired by and affected by the books they were reading that were coming in via the United Kingdom from British scholars and philosophers and translators, but they were getting it also from Ralph Waldo Emerson. Most of you know that Emerson was an important inspiration and influence on the Fillmores, as he has been on virtually every American in the last 150 or 200 years. And, but what you may not know is that Emerson and all the transcendentalists, especially Thoreau, were deeply influenced by the even earlier books and translations of Indian philosophy that were coming in. Emerson grew up with them because his dad, Reverend William Emerson, was a collector of those books and an advocate of the Asian religions that were then just first becoming known. And that influence permeates all of Emerson's work. It also is found in Thoreau's work, where in Walden he talks about reading the Bhagavad Gita every day and called himself a yogi. So all the people ever since who have been reading Emerson and Thoreau have been getting a taste of India, whether they realize it or not. And the same is true of the other early founders of New Thought, like Madame Blavatsky, who started Theosophy, and Mary Baker Eddy, who started Christian Science, and all the others. They were all reading these books from India and getting it indirectly from Emerson. And of course, the Fillmores were getting it from them and from Emerson and from their own reading. They also had a direct contact with the first of the great gurus and swamis and yoga masters who have been coming here from India for the last 120 years. This is Swami Vivekananda, who first came. He was the Jackie Robinson of the story I tell in American Veda. He was the first of the Hindu swamis who came, and it was 1893 at the World's Parliament of Religions in Chicago, and was the first to sort of break through the ignorance about the East and the prejudice we had about India to have an impact on the culture. And he became the star of that parliament and really launched an era of East-West meeting. And the Fillmores were present at the parliament, or at least Charles was. I've never been clear about that. So they no doubt heard Vivekananda speak because he was the talk of the town. Subsequent to that, we know that the Fillmores started Unity, and they had learned a lot. And in that very same issue of modern thought is this one. I was just astonished by this when I came upon it in my research. This, his essay, where he talks about India, also has this: we are all of one God, and it matters not from what source we get our religion. That's kind of in keeping with John Lennon, right? It matters not from what source we get our religion, if it has that spirit of love and charity which pervades the souls of all who find that place of peace which passeth understanding, which you just had a taste of in that lovely music and meditation. That is a pretty remarkable thing for 1889. It's a message of pluralism and the oneness that lives at the heart of all the world's spiritual traditions. That is still news to people today, and news that has to be heard and repeated over and over again. And I don't know how Charles Fillmore came upon that insight, but it is remarkably in keeping with the message that Vivekananda brought to that world's parliament of religion, because it's embedded deeply in the soul of all of Indian spiritual teachings for thousands and thousands of years, going back to the earliest of the world's sacred texts, the Rig Veda, where I'm not going to try the Sanskrit, but it has usually been translated as "truth is one, and the wise call it by many names," often abbreviated as "one truth, many paths," or "truth is one, paths are many." And the Fillmores and the early founders of New Thought got that. And when they introduced silent meditation into the unity repertoire, Charles Fillmore was researching the spiritual practices of the world's religions, and was probably one of the first Americans to write about what we now know of as mantras, because he wrote about the Hindu use of sound, sacred sounds in their meditation. When the Beatles went to India in 1968, then everybody knew the word mantra. He was ahead of his time. So was Ernest Holmes, who started Science of Mind, or religious science, who came a little later than the Fillmores, and was even more influenced by India, because by then there were even more books available and more texts available. And of course, he lived in Los Angeles in the mid part of the 20th century, so he had actually met gurus and was reading a lot of the more modern translations. And one of the people he knew or was reading was the sage, great sage of the first part of the 20th century, Sri Aurobindo. And he drew from the Bhagavad Gita and from Aurobindo's work. And when he passed, when Holmes passed, the Sri Aurobindo's great book, The Life Divine, was on his chest. He was reading it when he died. And he also knew personally Paramahansa Yogananda, the author of the classic memoir, Autobiography of a Yogi. How many have read? How many have heard of? Okay. The most often mentioned book in my research on how India has affected people's spiritual life, and a great influence on millions and millions of Americans, including Ernest Holmes, George Harrison, and a lot of other influential people. So what I'm saying is that all of New Thought, all of unity, has to some degree or another been affected by the teachings that came here from India. And they were not the only ones. Many, many other influential thinkers, leaders, religious and spiritual teachers, artists, musicians, philosophers, scholars have been affected by these teachings. And what happens is they read them, they're moved by them, they learn from them, they adapt them, they assimilate them, they retranslate them, they mix them with other influences and their own expertise, and their own unique insights, and it comes out being conveyed to the wider public as some integration of East and West in one form or another. And that's how millions and millions of Americans ultimately were influenced by these ideas. And that has had a tremendous impact on the culture. And so among the sources, there were gurus like Yogananda, and then in the late 60s and 1970s, this parade of gurus who came through our lives in America, all of whom had followers of one degree or another, and they affected the culture. And that is continuing to happen today with the current popular gurus. And we will pause for a moment to admire my clever use of product placement. And it came through philosophers and thinkers like Aldous Huxley and Houston Smith and Joseph Campbell, all of whom studied as young men with the Swamis of the Vedanta Society, which was the organization Vivekananda started, and whose chapters are all over the country, including Kansas City, where I spoke last week. And this is the 150th anniversary of Vivekananda's birth. And if you want to hear more about him and all these other teachings, I'm actually speaking I'm speaking this afternoon at 5 o'clock at the Hindu temple here in Kansas City, and I know they would love to have some non-Indian people come and enjoy their temple and the good food afterward. And it also came through literary giants like T.S. Eliot and J.D. Salinger and Allen Ginsberg, and also Yeats and Hermann Hesse and all these other people who conveyed it in poetry and fiction. And it came through men of science like the psychologist Abraham Maslow, who's transformed psychology with the introduction of spiritual ideas and practices, and Richard Alpert, who, as many of you know, became Ram Dass after his notorious exit from Harvard. And it comes through physicians even, like Dean Ornish and Deepak Chopra and Dr. Oz, all of whom are advocates of yogic practices and yogic ideas as health intervention. And it came through musicians like Ravi Shankar in the 1960s when he became a superstar, and John Coltrane, who became a very close friend of Ravi Shankar's, and he and his wife became deep practitioners of yoga and meditation. And his wife became a Swami, actually. And of course, most importantly, George Harrison, who conveyed these Eastern ideas in his music the rest of his life and turned his mates onto them, which gave us this seminal moment in history when the Beatles met Maharishi Mahesh Yogi and started to practice meditation and went to India. And as I like to think of it, it was a kind of watershed moment when the axis of the earth tilted so everything from India could flow here more easily and more quickly, and that opened the floodgates to the practices of meditation and yoga and all the other gurus who came here, and the legitimization of these teachings and these ideas, because it wasn't long after that studies were done on meditation and published in scientific journals, and that led to the possibility of people like Dr. Oz talking about these things on television, because there it is in science, verification of these practices and their utility in our lives, whether we're spiritual or religious or secular. All of this, including the influence of the East on certain important religious leaders of the West, people like Thomas Merton and Father Bede Griffith and Thomas Keating, who started centering prayer, and all these and Jewish equivalents who are influenced by and started to reinterpret their own religion with the help of the ideas and practices of the East. This has had a tremendous effect, and in many ways, they're sort of modern versions of the Fillmores, who created a spiritual tradition of their own that has Eastern elements in a sort of Christian context, and many other people have done that. The ultimate result of all this is that millions of people, including each of you, have been impacted by India to one degree or another, and it has changed not only individual lives, it has transformed individuals' understanding of what religion might be and what the practice of their own spirituality can be. It has opened up all these kind of doors to people. But it has also made it possible for people who are not religiously inclined, who don't like to show up on a Sunday morning anywhere, to have a real spiritual life because they have access to practices and teachings that can enrich their lives without them having to sign on to religious teachings or organizations that they're not inclined to. And so you have this phenomenon of people saying they're spiritual but not religious, which is the fastest growing category of religion in America. And it would be unthinkable without the access to these teachings that we think of as yoga or Indian philosophy. And I think this is one of the most important developments in American religious history. It has made us a more genuinely, authentically spiritual country. Just as unity has given people who are drawn to it a different way of thinking about religion and an orientation to religion or spirituality being an inside job, not just a question of outer profession of what you believe in or your affiliation, but something transformative through the inner life. Millions of people have done this. There are data on this. I can't bore you with this. This is a sermon after all, not a lecture. But ultimately, what has happened is Americans have come to define what spirituality is by virtue of the recognition of our own inner divine nature, which is something professed here every week. It was news to a great many people. And all these sources that I just mentioned were part of the transmission that made it possible for people to say, oh, I am not this, deep inside me, I am not what the psychologists say I am, this cauldron of neurosis. And I'm not what certain preachers say I am, this sinful being. I am divine. It's a shift in understanding of what we are in our essence. As some scholar put it, it's a shift from original sin to original bliss. That we were born in the bliss and the love that we define as God, and that is our nature. And that the reality of the spiritual life is to awaken to that reality of what we are inside, which is the essence of what Indian sages told us thousands of years ago in the famous sayings from the Upanishads that I am that and thou art that, and all this is that divine ultimate reality that each of us is. And that's what we have to awaken to. And when we awaken to that, our lives are transformed for the better. You have experienced this. Millions and millions of people now can experience this, whether they they go to the right church or synagogue, or they go to a yoga class, or they go to now they can go to their HMO and a doctor will tell them to meditate because it will be good for their blood pressure, and they are starting to unfold an inner life and we are becoming a more spiritual nation, and I think that will serve us well. But to get back to what the East teaches us, these are not just ideas. You know that old joke? There's a guy walking in New York, and he stops a New Yorker and says, how do I get to Carnegie Hall? And the answer is practice, practice, practice. That's the message of the East. Practice. These are not just ideas. There's a repertoire of, what yoga is a repertoire of practices that bring about the state of yoga. What is yoga? Unity. That's what it means. It means union. So you, as you sit here in meditation this morning, you are all yogis. You are experiencing, being drawn to the unity of the self, the inner, the personality, and the great personality of the cosmos that we call God, or ultimate reality, or the infinite. And that's the key takeaway from the East, the need for practice. You want to have a better life? Practice. You want to cultivate the powers of the mind, as New Thought teaches? Practice. You want to experience and live the consciousness of unity? Practice. You want more love and more compassion in your life? Practice. I find it remarkable how many people I know are genuinely spiritual, and they come to places like this, and they go to their yoga class, and they read the right books, but they don't practice. They don't do anything except when they show up somewhere. And this, if I have one takeaway from the East, it's practice. Practice regularly. I hear people all the time, as people know that I meditate, and I've been doing it for 45 years. And they say, well, I know I used to do that, or I should do that, but I don't have time. We're all so busy. And I think, what is more important? Jesus was right. I mean, Jesus told us, as you just heard, the kingdom of heaven is within us. And seek that first. He didn't say, when you retire. He didn't say after you take your kids to soccer. He didn't say after you check your email. He said, seek ye first. And that's what the yogis and the gurus have always said. Start your day that way, and all else will be added unto you. You will have a better life, a better day. I always quote Gandhi. It was a great moment in my life when I came upon this quote. It made my life easier. Gandhi one day, now mind you, Gandhi was a busy man. He didn't have children. He didn't, go to soccer games and PTA meetings. But he was trying to drive a colonial power out of his country. So he had a lot on his plate every day. And one day, apparently, he had a particularly busy calendar facing him. And he said, today is so busy that I'll have to meditate for 2 hours instead of just 1. Think about that. What was he saying? He was saying, this is not just important for its own sake, to experience the peace that passeth understanding, to dive within and experience your own peaceful inner nature. It is also a practical reality to make things better. It is a way to come back out into the world more effectively. He had a lot to do, so he was going to do more meditation, because he knew that if he was in touch with his inner nature, he'd make fewer mistakes. He'd come from a deeper place, a wiser place, a more energetic place than he would if he were, stressed out and agitated and busy monkey mind. There's practical value in this stuff. Practice. The great sage of the 19th century in India, Sri Ramakrishna, it is said that he too was a busy guy and a legendary yogi. And people would come to him, of course, for advice, what should I do, my children, blah, blah, blah. How do I find God? Whatever it was. And sometimes he'd be very busy, so he got his message down to, well, I don't know what the Bengali is, but it translates as dive deeper. And that was his key giveaway to people. Dive deeper, go deeper. And that's what I would leave you with. Dive deeper. Anytime you think, it'd be good to meditate, be good to have a spiritual practice this morning, but I don't have time. Remember Gandhi. I'll leave you to contemplate that next time. And I'll say namaste to all of you, and thank you for having me.